They say Hollywood rewards originality, unless you threaten the system. For every icon celebrated on the Walk of Fame, there are visionaries quietly erased for refusing to obey the studio's rules. Why did some of the most inventive minds in film vanish from the spotlight just as they changed the game? What really happens when talent collides with corporate control? The answers aren't found in the credits, but hidden between the lines, if you know where to look and who to remember. Oscar Micho. Long before the words independent cinema became a rallying cry, Oscar Micho was already running his own race, a race few in Hollywood wanted to acknowledge. As a black filmmaker in early 20th century America, Micho didn't just challenge racial stereotypes. He built his own movie-making world outside the studio gates, writing, directing, producing, and distributing over 40 feature films. But this wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. Micho took risks that studios wouldn't touch, depicting black ambition, resilience, and love at a time when mainstream Hollywood would only allow black characters as servants or comic relief. Studio bosses viewed him with suspicion and contempt. The mere act of a black man creating films for black audiences was seen as an act of rebellion. He refused to play by Hollywood's rules, distributing his films through a patchwork of segregated theaters and black-owned venues, keeping his work alive through grit and relentless hustle. But his defiance came at a cost. Hollywood ignored him. Trade papers rarely covered his work. Awards were out of the question. Over time, Micho's films disappeared from mainstream archives, his influence downplayed or erased entirely from cinema's official histories. Yet, his legacy is undeniable. He blazed a trail for generations of black filmmakers who would fight similar battles in decades to come. Today, Oscar Micho's name is seldom mentioned alongside Hollywood's greats, even though his innovations in storytelling, production, and distribution were decades ahead of his time. His erasure wasn't just about racism. It was about punishing a visionary who dared to prove the system didn't need to be as white or as closed as the studio bosses demanded. His story is a reminder. Sometimes the biggest threats to a broken system are those who simply refuse to play by its rules. Dorothy Arsner. Dorothy Arsner was a force of nature at a time when women in Hollywood were supposed to be seen, not heard. She wasn't interested in fitting into anyone's box. By the 1930s, Arsner had already broken barriers as the first woman to join the Directors Guild of America and the inventor of the boom microphone, a device that revolutionized sound filmmaking. But Arsner's greatest act of defiance wasn't technical. It was her determination to make films about women, for women, at a time when the studio system was dominated by men who saw female characters as mere decoration. She directed major features for Paramount and MGM, steering the careers of future legends like Katharine Hepburn and Lucille Ball, and her films routinely tackled issues of female independence, sexuality, and power, subjects considered far too risky by the industry's gatekeepers. But Arsner refused to let the studios silence her creative vision. She shaped her sets into spaces where actresses could push boundaries and find their voice, at a time when women in the director's chair were treated as anomalies or threats. Inevitably, Arsner's open defiance and unconventional personal life put her at odds with the men who ran Hollywood. She faced subtle and overt ostracism, increasingly sidelined from high-profile projects, and eventually found her directing opportunities dry up, not because she'd lost her touch, but because she wouldn't conform. When the histories of Hollywood were written, Arsner's pioneering contributions were left in the margins, if they appeared at all. Yet, her fingerprints are everywhere, in the freedom modern actresses enjoy, in the narrative depth given to female characters, and in the quiet courage of every director who refuses to shrink from a challenge. Dorothy Arsner's erasure wasn't just about gender. It was about the industry's fear of anyone who dared to change the script. Paul Robson. Paul Robson's story is not just one of talent and charisma. It's the saga of a man whose vision was too bold, too righteous, and too defiant for the Hollywood establishment. A trained lawyer, world-class athlete, acclaimed singer, and formidable actor, Robson was poised to become one of classic Hollywood's brightest stars. But he wanted more than applause. He wanted justice. At a time when studios thrived on caricatures and stereotypes, Robson used his platform to champion Black dignity and human rights, both on and off the screen. He famously rejected roles that demeaned African Americans, insisting on portraying characters with depth and dignity, a radical demand in the eyes of studio bosses who feared any challenge to the status quo. Robson's performances in films like The Emperor Jones and Showboat showcased not only his talent, but his unwillingness to settle for less than full humanity. But his activism didn't stop at the studio gates. He spoke out against racism in America, colonialism abroad, and the hypocrisy of an industry that would praise his voice, but tried to silence his truth. Hollywood retaliated the only way it knew how, with erasure. Robson was blacklisted, his films suppressed, his recordings pulled from shelves, and his passport revoked to prevent him from performing internationally. Studios quietly scrubbed his name from their records, and Robson's place in Hollywood's pantheon of greats was diminished by decades of deliberate neglect. Today, when classic Hollywood is celebrated, Robson's contributions are often reduced to footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. But his spirit lingers, a reminder that true innovation is sometimes punished, not rewarded, by those afraid of what it might unleash. Paul Robson defied the studios not just for himself, but for everyone who would come after. That's why Hollywood tried so hard to erase him, and why his legacy refuses to disappear. John Garfield. John Garfield was never supposed to be a rebel. He was a studio creation, brooding, working class, and electric on screen. Yet, beneath the polished image, Garfield was a man of principle who despised the hypocrisy of the Hollywood system. In an era when studios dictated everything from an actor's roles to their personal beliefs, Garfield dared to think for himself. He spoke openly about the rights of artists, and when the Hollywood blacklist swept through the industry, he stood his ground while others cowered or conformed. The post-war Red Scare made any hint of dissent dangerous, and Garfield's progressive politics made him a target. He refused to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, declining to betray colleagues or friends for personal survival. Studios, terrified of government scrutiny, distanced themselves. Projects evaporated. Offers stopped. Once one of the most in-demand actors of his generation, Garfield was suddenly persona non grata, a ghost in a town he'd once dominated. The tragedy was not just professional, it was deeply personal. The constant stress and isolation took its toll on his health. Garfield died at just 39, his career cut brutally short by a climate of paranoia and fear. Hollywood, eager to avoid scandal, quietly moved on. His name faded from the A-list, and later studio histories rarely gave him the credit he deserved for standing up when it mattered most. Yet, John Garfield's refusal to bend still echoes in every performer who chooses integrity over convenience. His erasure was the industry's attempt to make an example out of him, warning others not to challenge the system. But in the end, Garfield's rebellious spirit became a blueprint for the courageous few who would eventually break Hollywood's blacklist, reminding the world that conscience should never be a career liability. Ida Lupino. Ida Lupino was a storm that Hollywood never saw coming. At a time when actresses were expected to play the part both on and off the screen, Lupino charted her own unpredictable course, leaving the safety of studio contracts to become a pioneering director, writer, and producer. She co-founded her own production company in the 1940s, a near unheard-of move for a woman, and set out to make movies about subjects the studios would not touch: unwed mothers, sexual assault, mental illness, and other social taboos. Her films, raw and unflinching, gave voice to those Hollywood preferred to keep silent. She cast ordinary people in lead roles and focused on the struggles of the overlooked, the outcasts, and the wounded. The studios, in response, labeled her difficult, an outsider, a risk. Hollywood's power brokers quietly conspired to keep her films underfunded and underdistributed, and industry coverage of her work was minimal compared to her male counterparts. The result? A career repeatedly stunted by forces determined to keep the industry's status quo intact. Despite these barriers, Lupino's innovations in camera work, character psychology, and narrative structure influenced generations of filmmakers, though her name was often omitted from official histories. She continued working on television, carving out a place for herself in an industry that never fully welcomed her, and mentoring other women who refused to take no for an answer. Ida Lupino's story is a testament to the price of defiance in Hollywood. Her erasure was as systematic as it was silent, accomplished not through open hostility, but by denying her the recognition, resources, and reach her work so clearly deserved. Today, her films are being rediscovered, and her legacy is being restored. But for decades, she was the industry's best-kept secret, a visionary erased because she refused to be controlled. Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo's pen was a weapon, sharp, witty, and utterly fearless. One of the most celebrated screenwriters of the 1940s, Trumbo wrote classics like Kitty Foyle and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. But his insistence on political independence would make him one of the most famous casualties of the Hollywood blacklist. Called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, Trumbo refused to cooperate, famously quipping, "This is the beginning of an American concentration camp." The studios responded by making him invisible. He was fired, blacklisted, and officially erased from credits, contracts, and conversations. But Trumbo refused to vanish. Working under pseudonyms, he continued to write, even winning 2 Academy Awards for films credited to front writers, Roman Holiday and The Brave One. Hollywood's hypocrisy was on full display. Studios denounced him publicly, while quietly buying his scripts in secret. The absurdity of the blacklist was never more clear than in Trumbo's dual existence as both a pariah and a provider of blockbuster hits. For years, Trumbo's name could not appear on screen. He endured financial hardship, public scorn, and the knowledge that his most successful work was celebrated under someone else's name. Only in the 1960s, when industry leaders finally broke with the blacklist, did Trumbo's role become public again. He was at last allowed to claim his place in film history, but decades of recognition had already been stolen. Dalton Trumbo's story is a case study in both the cruelty and the absurdity of Hollywood's self-censorship. The studios erased him not because he lacked talent, but because he wouldn't surrender his mind to their control. And yet, in the shadows, he proved that a true innovator can never be fully erased, as long as there's a story to tell, and someone brave enough to tell it. Orson Wells. Orson Wells entered Hollywood like a storm. Too creative, too independent, and far too bold for the studio chiefs who expected obedience. At just 25, Wells directed, co-wrote, and starred in Citizen Kane, a film so innovative it rewrote the language of cinema. The studios had never seen anything like him, but Wells refused to play by their rules. He demanded final cut, clashed with executives, and challenged the industry's power structure at every turn. After Kane, when RKO Pictures saw the final cut of his next film, The Magnificent Ambersons, they panicked. Wells was overseas, and while he was gone, the studio seized the negative, re-edited it, cut 40 minutes, and tacked on a new ending, ignoring his creative vision entirely. Hollywood executives labeled Wells difficult, arrogant, and unreliable, industry code words for anyone who won't surrender control. His contract was canceled, and the press, manipulated by studio PR, painted him as a failed prodigy who had squandered his genius. Offers from the majors dried up. Wells was forced into exile, financing projects himself, acting in other people's films just to pay for his own. Despite his continued brilliance, Touch of Evil, The Trial, and Chimes at Midnight, he was rarely trusted with a big budget again. For decades, Wells's reputation was that of a has-been, a Hollywood warning story about the perils of challenging studio authority. Only in later years did film scholars and audiences reclaim his legacy as a true visionary. But the damage was done. Wells's career had been systematically diminished because he refused to let Hollywood turn innovation into just another product. His story is a lesson in how the industry responds to those who won't bow down, and a testament to the kind of creativity that can never truly be erased, no matter how hard the system tries. Myrna Loy. Myrna Loy's luminous beauty and sly wit made her the reigning queen of sophisticated comedies in the 1930s and 1940s. She was the perfect wife in the Thin Man series, a studio darling, and a guaranteed box office draw. But behind the carefully constructed studio persona, Loy was deeply principled and fiercely independent. She was outspoken about racial injustice, women's rights, and the abuse of power in Hollywood, issues most actors were afraid to even mention. Loy refused to take roles that demeaned women or minorities, turning down lucrative contracts and criticizing the very system that made her famous. Her activism soon made her a target. Studio heads, especially at MGM, grew wary of her public statements and off-screen leadership. While they couldn't openly fire a star of her caliber, they began offering her fewer prominent roles, quietly shunting her to the margins as new starlets were promoted in her place. The press, fed by studio gossip, painted her as difficult and political, and by the early 1950s, Loy's career had been quietly deflated by the same system that once celebrated her. Despite her declining presence in Hollywood films, Loy continued to speak out, serving on the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing, and as a UNESCO delegate. She never apologized for using her fame as a platform, even as studios worked to erase her influence and legacy. For decades, her contributions to Hollywood and society were downplayed or ignored, her activism almost an embarrassment to a business that preferred its stars silent and smiling. Today, Myrna Loy is recognized as more than just a star. She's seen as a trailblazer who challenged Hollywood's silent complicity and paid the price. Her erasure was the industry's way of sending a message. Principles come with consequences. But Loy's legacy, though nearly buried, proved impossible to silence forever. Preston Sturgis. Preston Sturgis was a rare breed in the 1940s. Hollywood, comedies, like The Lady Eve and Sullivan's Travels, exploded with wit and anarchic energy, lampooning Hollywood's greed, hypocrisy, and obsession with image. He won the first ever Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, and for a brief, dazzling period, he was allowed to call his own shots, a near miracle in a studio-dominated era. But Sturgis's streak of independence quickly made him enemies. He fought constantly with executives over budgets, casting, and final cuts. He refused to write safe, formulaic scripts, instead stuffing his movies with biting social commentary and jabs at the industry's most sacred cows. Studio bosses grew impatient with his perfectionism and public irreverence. They branded him unmanageable, and after a string of less profitable films, he was quietly nudged out of Paramount. Hollywood's institutional memory is short when it comes to rebels. Sturgis spent his later years bouncing between studios and struggling to get projects greenlit. He was denied the financial and creative backing given to more compliant filmmakers. When he died in 1959, his reputation had dimmed, his credits minimized, and his influence largely unrecognized. The industry he mocked so mercilessly erased him, hoping to discourage future iconoclasts. Yet, decades later, Sturgis's innovations are regarded as some of the most important in American comedy. His rapid-fire dialogue, absurdist setups, and satirical targets are now industry standards. His erasure was Hollywood's way of trying to bury a mirror that reflected its flaws. But true innovation, no matter how hard the machine tries to suppress it, finds its way back to the surface. And Preston Sturgis remains a testament to the power of laughing at the system, even when it's determined to laugh last. Clara Bose. Clara Bose was the face of the Roaring Twenties. Irrepressible, magnetic, and unmistakably modern. Her infectious spirit made her Hollywood's original it girl, turning her into one of the first true movie superstars. Audiences saw her as the embodiment of youthful freedom and glamour. But behind the scenes, Bose was fighting battles that would eventually lead to her erasure. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Clara refused to let the studio system control every detail of her life. She spoke candidly about exploitation, pay inequity, and the relentless pressures placed on women to maintain a manufactured image. Bose's defiance terrified studio bosses, who relied on compliant stars to maintain their profitable illusions. Instead of bowing to their authority, she rebelled, refusing to hide her Brooklyn accent, resisting forced publicity stunts, and pushing back when her boundaries were crossed. Her candor about mental health struggles, family trauma, and the exploitation she endured made her a target. The gossip machine went into overdrive, feeding the press with lurid tales of scandal and instability. When Clara suffered a breakdown in the early 1930s, the studios seized their opportunity. She was quietly dropped from major productions, her image scrubbed from promotional materials, and her pioneering contributions downplayed. She spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity, even as Hollywood celebrated the new stars who had learned to play by the rules. Yet, Clara Bose's impact never truly faded. She proved that a woman could command the screen on her own terms, and inspired countless actresses to demand more from the industry. Her erasure was a calculated act by studios desperate to maintain control over a changing world. Today, her legacy is being rediscovered, proof that real trailblazers are never erased for long, no matter how hard the system tries to write them out of history. James Whale. James Whale was one of the creative forces who defined the horror genre, directing classics like Frankenstein, 1931, The Invisible Man, 1933, and Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. His films combined technical innovation with emotional depth, and his signature style, wry, gothic, and subversive, pushed boundaries in ways that both thrilled and unsettled audiences. But Whale was also openly gay in an era of profound intolerance, and his refusal to hide his identity or conform to the studio playbook set him on a collision course with Hollywood's gatekeepers. After his early successes at Universal, Whale continued to take risks, casting outsiders, injecting subtext, and elevating material that studios viewed as mere genre fare. When he turned down projects he found uninspired, executives began to label him as difficult and unpredictable. The pressure mounted after the success of Bride of Frankenstein, and, with Universal changing hands, the new regime made it clear that Whale's independent streak and his open queerness were no longer welcome. Offers dried up. The studio stopped assigning him major films. In a few short years, the director whose work had made Universal a powerhouse was quietly pushed to the margins, and then out of the business altogether. For decades, Whale's name was seldom mentioned in Hollywood histories, his pioneering contributions to cinema and queer representation minimized or ignored. James Whale's story is a stark example of how Hollywood erases innovators who refuse to hide who they are or what they believe. His films, long overlooked by mainstream critics, are now regarded as masterworks. His journey from celebrated auteur to industrial exile reveals just how fragile creative freedom was in classic Hollywood and how costly it could be to stand out when conformity was the currency of success. May Wong. May Wong was a cinematic trailblazer, Hollywood's first Chinese-American movie star, and an international icon. Her career should have been a triumph, but Wong refused to accept the boundaries set by a racist industry. At a time when Chinese characters were routinely played by white actors in yellowface, and Asian performers were relegated to subservient or villainous roles. Wong demanded dignity and respect. She turned down roles she found demeaning, even when they were the only ones offered by major studios. Wong's outspokenness was both her greatest strength and the reason for her professional erasure. When she was passed over for the lead in The Good Earth, a film about Chinese peasants, in which the lead was given to a white actress in makeup, she protested publicly. Studios retaliated, slashing her opportunities and shuffling her into secondary roles or foreign productions. Wong's international acclaim only made Hollywood more resentful of her independence. As anti-Asian sentiment surged during World War II, Wong found herself pushed even further from the spotlight. Her name faded from marquees, her movies rarely revived, and her legacy systematically overlooked by a system eager to bury the evidence of its own prejudice. For decades, her groundbreaking achievements were footnoted, if mentioned at all, in the story of Hollywood's golden age. May Wong's refusal to accept erasure became her lasting triumph. She paved the way for future generations of Asian actors and filmmakers, showing that dignity is worth any price. Today, her legacy is being reclaimed by a new wave of storytellers, determined that no one with her courage or talent will ever be erased again. Her story stands as a testament to what Hollywood lost when it chose exclusion over innovation. Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was one of classic Hollywood's most luminous stars, a woman whose beauty, intelligence, and emotional depth lit up the screen in films like Laura and Leave Her to Heaven. But behind the glamour was a fiercely independent spirit who refused to let the studios dictate her every move. Tierney's troubles with the system began when she resisted Hollywood's obsession with packaging and controlling its leading ladies. She spoke out about her struggles with mental health, the devastating loss of her child, and the relentless scrutiny of her personal life, subjects that made studio bosses nervous and threatened the carefully manufactured facade they tried to maintain. Tierney's refusal to play along with the PR machine meant she often found herself at odds with the very institutions that once promoted her. The studio heads wanted their stars to be silent about suffering and compliant with the rules, especially the unwritten ones. When she chose to step back from acting to seek treatment for her mental health, the response was swift and cold. Projects disappeared, offers dwindled, and suddenly, the once favored leading lady was considered a liability rather than an asset. Her return to the screen was met with polite but limited opportunities, as the studios quietly distanced themselves from a star who had shown her humanity in public. Tierney's legacy was overshadowed for decades, her contributions minimized in industry retrospectives, and her bravery in confronting taboo subjects often omitted from the official record. Yet, Gene Tierney's willingness to challenge the system and speak her truth paved the way for future generations of actors to discuss mental health openly. Her erasure was the cost of candor in an era obsessed with illusion, but her impact, long hidden, has finally begun to shine through, reminding us that Hollywood's greatest stars are sometimes those who refuse to be silent, no matter the cost. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum's screen presence was so natural, so effortless, that Hollywood often tried to define him with a single word: rebel. But Mitchum's rebellion wasn't just an act. It was a way of life that made him both an icon and a liability. In an industry built on control, Mitchum's refusal to follow the rules marked him as a troublemaker. He openly mocked the Hollywood machine, brushed off studio mandates, and made no secret of his contempt for the pretensions of fame. When he was arrested for marijuana possession in 1948, a scandal that would have ended most careers, Mitchum's response was unrepentant and almost casual, making a mockery of the moral outrage studios wanted to project. Instead of towing the line, Mitchum embraced his outsider status, giving interviews that exposed the industry's hypocrisies, and refusing to let executives dictate the kinds of roles he would accept. The studios, unsure how to handle his independence, alternated between exploiting his bad boy image and quietly sidelining him from prestige projects. For every classic film like Out of the Past or Night of the Hunter, there were years of lesser roles and underutilized talent. Hollywood's subtle way of punishing those who wouldn't play along. In later years, as the industry evolved and old scandals faded, Mitchum's legacy was slowly rehabilitated, his contributions recognized as part of the anti-hero movement that redefined American cinema. But for decades, he was marginalized, typecast, and denied the full range of opportunities his talent deserved, all for refusing to let the studios own him, on or off the screen. Mitchum's story is a classic example of how Hollywood treats its nonconformists, with grudging admiration, strategic exclusion, and attempts at erasure. His survival was an act of will, and his legacy, a reminder that sometimes the only way to truly innovate is to break every rule in the book. Herbert Bberman. Herbert Bberman was a respected director and screenwriter, but his greatest achievement would also become his greatest curse. In 1954, Bberman directed Salt of the Earth, a film so daring, so radical, that Hollywood did everything in its power to erase it. Made at the height of the Red Scare, Salt of the Earth depicted a real-life strike by Mexican-American mine workers in New Mexico, and dared to show working-class people and women as the central agents of change. The studios, terrified of being associated with leftist ideas, blacklisted Bberman for refusing to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. As a result, he was ostracized from the industry, denied work, and targeted by both government agencies and industry watchdogs. The production of Salt of the Earth was beset by sabotage. Film labs refused to process footage, unions boycotted, and the FBI harassed the cast and crew. When the film was finally completed, virtually no theater in America would show it, and Bberman was branded as an enemy of the state and a pariah in Hollywood. For decades, Bberman's name was scrubbed from studio histories, his work barely acknowledged, and his film locked away from public view. His wife, actress Gail Zondergaard, also saw her career destroyed in the fallout. But Bberman never apologized for his convictions or for making art that told the truth as he saw it. Salt of the Earth survived underground and is now celebrated as a landmark in independent cinema and social activism. Bberman's erasure was the studio's ultimate punishment for an artist who valued conscience over compliance. His resilience in the film he risked everything to make stand as a monument to creative courage and the high price paid by those who refused to be silenced in Hollywood's darkest hours. In Hollywood, those who dared to challenge the system often paid with their careers or their place in history. Yet, as the lights dim and credits roll, their innovations and courage refuse to disappear. The studio bosses may have tried to erase these voices, but their stories have a way of resurfacing, inspiring new generations to dream and defy. The real legacy of Hollywood isn't just on the screen, but in the rebels who risked everything to make cinema truly original.